Welcome to Gallery Teachers Masterclass. This is André Hedlund, and I'm a Chevening alumnus. I have a master's degree in psychology of education from the University of Bristol, and I work as a bilingual program mentor in Brazil. So today we're going to talk about Engage, Build, and Consolidate, an effective framework for lesson planning and lesson delivery according to the science of learning. Let's go over the masterclass agenda. So we're going to start with the science of learning, just a quick overview for you to understand where to find more information about this new science. Then we're going to talk about the Engage, Build, and Consolidate framework. Then we're going to focus on each one of those principles. First, engage, then build, then consolidate. And I'm going to give you some practical tips for you to use when you are planning your lessons and delivering your lessons. Now, before we get going, let's think of some big questions. Do we plan our lessons based on how students learn? Do you think you even know how students learn from a neuroscientific and psychological perspective? So are we well informed about how learning takes place? Well, let's talk about that. So the science of learning has as main question, how do we learn more effectively? And it looks at the contributions of other fields such as cognitive, social, and developmental psychology, cognitive neuroscience, educational psychology, the one that I studied at the University of Bristol, educational neuroscience, and mind-brain education, a transdisciplinary area that looks at education and policy and research and how we can put those things together. If you want to know more about the science of learning and this framework in particular, you can go to scienceoflearning-ebc.org, and you will actually find a lot of interesting resources by the University of Bristol that were developed by my professor, Paul Howard-Jones, and his team of collaborators. And that's what I'm going to get into right now, the science of learning and this framework. So what is the Engage, Build, and Consolidate framework? Well, the Engage, Build, and Consolidate framework is an interesting, insightful, and very informative framework that we can use to plan our lessons and deliver our lessons to maximize our students' learning outcomes, because it's based on how they actually learn. It's based on how the brain learns and how the mind learns. So that's why I call it an effective framework for lesson planning. If you look at the overall description of the EBC framework, you will see that the very first principle of this framework is to engage your students. We understand from a neuroscientific perspective that students who are engaged, they pay attention. If they are paying attention, they will make new memories. If they have made new memories, they will have learned. If that doesn't happen, then they're not paying attention, they're not making new memories, they won't have learned. And the idea of engaging your students has to do with an emotional and cognitive process that are going inside the brain. So it's a bidirectional arrow inside your brain, your cortex, and your subcortical areas, like the hippocampus, the amygdala, because this is how the brain works. Now, if you think about build, how we make new knowledge available inside our brains, that has to do with your working memory. So that's why you can see those frontal areas of your brain highlighted in the schematic there on the slide. Our working memory capacity is quite limited, so we have to respect that to make sure that our students will learn more effectively. And finally, we need to consolidate knowledge because we have to apply that in different contexts and make it available so that we can retrieve it later on in life when we need it. So consolidation takes time, but it's really about sending that new knowledge or information to other areas of the brain so that it can be encoded in the brain cortex. If you think about some of the main tips for the very first principle of this framework, engage, what we have there is every brain is unique. So make sure your students know that, make sure you know that. And how do you do that? The very first thing you can do is to work with differentiation and personalization. And I'm going to give you some practical tips in a second. But I'm pretty sure you already know how to do that to a certain extent, right? You realize that different students are engaged in different ways because they have different likes and dislikes and different interests. So we have to try to maximize their voice and choice. Sometimes when we are working with different materials, maybe the materials will not offer those possibilities. So we have to create those possibilities. I think I can best summarize that in that sentence. What interests Peter might not interest Jane or Andre, me. So here's a practical tip for you. Let's imagine you're working with past perfect, right? One of the most conventional ways to do that is to have your students draw a timeline and add different events that took place in the past. And then they can say, for example, that something had happened before something else. That's totally fine. But one way to add voice and choice differentiation is to have them work with photographs. So maybe they can get old pictures of their family, and then they can organize them in terms of when they happened, and they can compare things and describe using past perfect. Another thing you can do is tap into their interests. So one example is what happened to my student Alini, who wasn't really engaged, but she happened to have a blog and she wanted to show us her blog. So I asked her to use past perfect to describe when she wrote the blog posts, and she became much more engaged. Now, for a second principle to engage, we have approach response. And approach response has a lot to do with being human, showing that you are human, because we're working nowadays from a screen. We don't have physical contact anymore because of the pandemic. So you have to show that you are interested in your students' likes and dislikes. You want to make them curious, and you want to offer them novelty. Tap into their curiosity, acknowledge their efforts. One way you can do that is to tell them job well done when they actually do something that you ask them to do. You also can share attention with them, and you can have them share attention in pairs or in larger groups. So you can send them to breakout rooms, for example, or you can have them share on different tools that are available online, like Padlet, Nearpod, or anything that connects them. The third thing about Engage that really makes a difference is to reduce fearfulness and anxiety, to actually establish rapport with your students. And even though you know that, how often are you using that, and how effective is it? So think about a couple of things that can make you connect with your students, because that has to do with Stephen Krashen said a couple of years ago, actually many years ago, about the affective filter. It has to do with establishing a safe environment for your students to feel that they can make mistakes without being judged. And that makes a difference. Think of a student who might be saying something like, I'm terrified of making a mistake in front of my peers. Now, I'm going to give you some practical tips. So one of the most basic things that I do, and it always works, is a true or false about myself, because then I can connect to my students in a personal way. So think about those two sentences about me. I'll give you 10 seconds to try to figure out which one is true and which one is false. Or maybe they're both true or false. So the very first one is, I have a stuffed elephant. And the second is, my dad was Swedish. So try to figure out yourself. Well, if you said that they're both true, you got it right. And I can show you my elephant right now. His name is Mr. Trunk. And now you know something about me, something personal. And that means that we have established a more positive connection, that we have promoted some rapport. And that makes a difference, because your students will want to learn more from you if they know you as a person. The fourth thing that we really have to focus on when we want to engage our students is the concept of neuroplasticity. So many of our students don't really know what goes on inside their brains when they're learning, but we can learn so that we can teach them that. A couple of things that you can always make space for in your classes are metacognition, so the idea of learning how to learn, self-efficacy, the idea that if your students really want to, and if they know how to prioritize things and organize their study time, they will be on task in the long run. And you can help them develop that. And also the idea of a growth mindset to help them focus on the process, not the product, to help them make the effort and commit to things you want them to do. Think about this sentence. I'd love to know more about the brain and how we learn. So why don't you have maybe 5 minutes in every lesson you teach about some brain facts to help your students reflect on how they learn better? This is a great idea. Now, let's do some active retrieval. So active retrieval has to do with trying to remember the things you've been exposed to, because this is going to help you reinforce some of those neuronal networks that are going to become memories in your brain. So I'm going to give you now about 30 seconds for you to try to remember anything, really anything we've been discussing so far. So there you go. Okay, so I think that's enough. If you were able to remember a couple of things, that's great. If you couldn't remember it all, that's also fine. That's why we have to keep working on the things we're trying to learn, because sometimes it just doesn't come as easily, right? Now let's move on to the second principle of our EBC framework, build. So how do we build, right? Very first thing we can talk about is prior knowledge. We want our students to activate their prior knowledge. And we want to do that so that we build the foundation for new knowledge. It's like building a wall. You really can't build a wall without first building its foundation. We have a lot of evidence to suggest that a couple of things work really well. Pre-testing. So let's imagine you're going to teach your students past continuous or something like that. Maybe they already know something. You have to quiz them to make sure that they know something. And when you pre-test them, even if they don't know, they will be more curious to find out throughout the lesson. So if they made mistakes, if they got some wrong answers, they will really pay attention because they want to know why they made mistakes, right? You can work with retrieval practice just like we did a couple of minutes ago. Just give them some time to try to retrieve those things, the things that they were exposed to. And then finally, you can do something that we've been doing as teachers for a very long time, the think, pair, share routine. But I have to stress something here. First, they think individually, because if they're thinking together in pairs, one person is normally doing the thinking and giving the answers. The other one is not doing much. So first they think individually, then you put them together, and then they can share, okay? And use whatever tools you have online if you are teaching remotely. Like I said, you can use a learning management system, you can use Padlet, you can use anything that connects them, even WhatsApp or Facebook. The second part is working memory. So we understand from a lot of evidence that our working memory is incredibly limited. But we still throw a lot of information at our students because this is just, how things are set up. The educational system is like that, right? But to compare, think of it as watering my herbs here in my apartment every day with 5 liters of water. That doesn't work very well, does it? There's too much water. I'm probably going to drown my herbs here. I have some mint, I have some sage. I have to do it in a way that they can actually take it and absorb the water and thrive. So, how can we do that for our students? We have to reduce their cognitive load. How do we do that? Well, we can work with analogies and we can work with brain breaks. Now, let me give you some practical tips again. Okay, so for practical tips, imagine you're going to work with the third conditional. So that could be quite hard for your students, right? Because the construction goes something like this. If I had studied more, I would have passed the test. Now, if that's too complicated for them, one thing you can do is think of it as baby steps. So instead of actually presenting both clauses at the same time, just focus on the first one, drill, make sure that they got it, and then you move to the next one. It has to do with chunking. This is how our brains learn, by breaking very complex things into smaller things so that we can understand. The other thing you can do is work with analogies. So I tried my best to draw this guy here, Thanos, from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because one of the things that teens are really into, and even adults like myself, is superheroes, right? And we really love those stories because we connect with them somehow. And for those of you who haven't watched the Marvel Cinematic Universe, all of the movies, so major spoilers now, but Thanos wants to wipe out half of life in the whole universe. So this is the perfect analogy for you to work with third conditional, because you can do something like, I don't know, maybe if they had removed the Infinity Stone from Vision, they would have stopped Thanos or something like that. And they can connect very easily. And then finally, one of the things that you can do is implement brain breaks. They work wonders because then they will help your students relax a little bit. So for your brain break now, you can check Mr. Trunk Travels. That's a hashtag. Go to your favorite social media, Instagram or Facebook, and find some very cool pictures of my friend, Mr. Trunk, the traveling elephant. So the third element of build is the mirror neuron system. It's a bunch of neurons that we have in our brains, and they are specialized to activate when we observe other human beings doing something. So we can learn from their attitudes, we can learn from their actions. That's why we have to be enthusiastic, because then we'll help our students become enthusiastic as well. We have to use our body language effectively. So we can use gestures to signal, for example, comparative. So we want more or less, we can do something with our hands like that. If we want them to give us an affirmative sentence, we can do something like that, thumbs up, and maybe thumbs down for a negative sentence. And we can work with total physical response, TPR. So maybe you want to practice some tag questions, and you can tell your students that when you raise your hand, some of them will say, for example, he doesn't work here, does he? And then when you raise your left hand, they're going to change it to the negative or something like that, so that it becomes very visual. And one of the feelings I get from our students is, this lesson is boring. It feels like my teacher doesn't want to be here. So make it fun, make it pleasant. It doesn't have to be fun all the time, but pleasant. Make them want to be there. And like I said, use brain breaks. But here are a couple of ideas for you when you implement brain breaks. So one of the things you can do is ask your students to analyze your facial expressions. So if you want, you can maybe put on a happy face or a sad face or a surprise or something like that, and they can guess what you are feeling. And then they can do the same. You can get the guitar and play a song, or you can just play a song from your own computer. You can have something like I did with you, Where's Mr. Trunk? So it breaks the routine, right? It's very important because their brains get to relax a little bit. And you can do something that we normally do with animals, go fetch. So if you're working with young learners, it could be very useful to send them around the house to find something that has to do with the lesson that you're teaching. So maybe something in color red or blue, or maybe a particular shape, and that will help them become more interested and engage more in your class, and also help them reduce the cognitive overload that they're going through. Now, some active retrieval for you. Remember, try to remember as much as you can about everything we've been discussing here. So I'll give you a couple of seconds. Okay, hopefully that was enough. Again, if you were able to remember a couple of things, that's awesome. If you could remember everything, that's even better. But if you couldn't, that's also fine. It just means you need to spend more time revisiting the content. And that's why active retrieving is a wonderful technique for you. Now we're approaching the last bit of the EBC framework. So how to consolidate. Consolidation has a lot to do with making this new knowledge available in the brain so that you can retrieve later on, whenever you want. So one of the first things we have to do is to rehearse what we are being exposed to. How do we do that? I've shown you a couple of elements already. Retrieval practice works wonder. So make sure your students stop at some point in the class so that they can try to remember everything they've been exposed to so far. That's really great for your brain. The other thing we've been doing, but not systematically, I think, is CCQs. So concept checking questions. Normally teachers will go like, did you get it? Is everything okay? And students will normally say yes because they don't want to expose themselves. So instead of asking questions like that, you can ask them to give examples, to use in a sentence. So we talked about third conditional, didn't we? And we talked about past perfect. Instead of saying, are you okay? Did you get everything I said? Just ask, Peter, can you give me an example with the third conditional? And then you will really be able to check whether they are able to apply that or not. Finally, you can do a lot of drilling. Drilling is really important for you to repeat things in your brain, to rehearse them so that they become more consolidated. So remember, practice doesn't make perfect, but it makes more permanent, according to neuroscience. Applying knowledge. So if you want to have knowledge available, the new information that you learned available later on for you to apply in different contexts, you have to apply then. There's no way out of it. So how do you do it? For example, so some practical tips are, let's imagine you're working with vocabulary and you want your students to make very interesting visuals so that it helps them apply that knowledge in a different context. So if you're working with animals, one thing you can do is a Venn diagram. So you can think of two different categories, two different circles, and then where they meet, maybe there's some overlapping there. And it's a very visual way for them to categorize what they're learning. Another way you can work with diagrams or graphic organizers is to use mind maps. So mind maps, they don't work very well for very complex or very difficult topics, but they do work fine for vocabulary, such as food. So let's imagine you want to reinforce food vocabulary. So you write food here, and then maybe you can write fruit, vegetables, pasta, different types of meat, whatever you want. That makes it more organized and easier for your students to revisit later. Finally, one thing you can do is have them apply the knowledge that they got in your classroom in their real lives. So they can interview their parents about traveling, for example, or about anything they want, and then they can record themselves doing that and bring back to your class so that everybody can benefit from their material. And the sentence here is, how do I use this information in my daily life? And that's a gap that we have to address. Many times it's not evident. So we have to show our students that this is actually going to help them do something real, something relevant, something that they can apply. So the very last element of consolidate is sleeping. And sleeping is something you don't have a lot of control of, but I'm going to give you some tips to make this happen. We consolidate memory during our sleep, especially vocabulary, for example, because it falls under the category of declarative memory, memory for concepts. So how do you do it? Well, one thing you can help your students do is set up a schedule or a calendar for them to actually do the homework after they have slept. Yes. So instead of sending them homework to be done on the same day of your class, ask them to do it the next day, because they will have slept, they will have consolidated some memory, and then the act of retrieving that information to do the homework will help them strengthen those memories in their brain cortex. Now you can also work with cued recall. And how does that work? Well, you can have some colored Post-its all over the house with different questions, and then when the students are walking around their house, they look at the Post-it and they have to try to remember something. Another way you can do that, you can have those page markers that I'm showing you right here. So you can have some page markers to make sure that your students do some active retrieving when they are browsing through the pages of their books or notebooks. And you can set up this calendar to work with spaced repetition. So here, just to give you an example, lesson 1 happened on Monday, for example. You retrieved the contents of lesson 1 the next day because you slept, so on Tuesday, and then you had lesson 2 on Wednesday. You retrieve the contents of lesson 2 on Thursday, and then you go to lesson 1 again on Friday. So you can use flashcards to retrieve some content related to lesson 1. And then finally, on Saturday, you can do the same for lesson 2. And then there should be some moments like, take a look at R1, 2. So that's when you retrieve the contents of lesson 1 and 2. That's how you do it. The more you revisit something, the better you can consolidate that in your brain. So to wrap up this input session, I'm going to give you a couple of seconds for you to try to retrieve all of the things you've been exposed to. So how about 30 seconds? Starting now. Okay, that's it, folks. All right, folks. So if you want to get more useful resources from the ELT world, please do check the Gallery Teachers Workshops website. Just check the link on your screen, and I'm sure you're going to find something very useful for your classes. It's important for teachers to understand how students learn, because if we do understand that, I think we can better plan our lessons in a way that will help them achieve more effective learning outcomes. The idea here is, for example, if you don't know how our memory systems work, how can you expect students to actually remember things that you teach them if you have no idea about basic principles of, neuroanatomy, for example? So here, I'm not saying we should know a lot of detail and jargon or scientific words for how the brain works, but I think we do have to know basic principles, just as we know for anything else that we do. For, let's say, how to be well fed, how to get the best nutrition from your food. So we understand those principles, but I feel like we don't understand the principles of how the brain and the mind learn. And that's why we're probably overloading our students' brain. And that's why we're probably not achieving the best outcomes that we could. Well, the Engage, Build, and Consolidate framework is different, and it will help you become a better teacher because, first of all, it's based on the science of learning. And it was something developed at the University of Bristol. The head of the team that developed this framework is one of the biggest references in neuroeducation in the world, Paul Howard Jones. And it really looks at how the brain engages, builds knowledge, and consolidates that as learning. And those are the main steps for you to really learn anything, and not just learn as we think of learn, but really long-term learning for you to retrieve years later, for you to actually have everlasting learning. That's what we want when we are teachers. We want our students to learn and to remember the things that we teach them. And since it's based on the science of learning, we can say that it's evidence informed. So it's something that really has a lot of contributions from different fields, so that you as a teacher, you don't really have to do so much research on your own, but you can actually rely on this framework. And this will definitely help you plan better lessons and deliver better lessons. The Engage, Build, Consolidate framework is something that novice and more qualified teachers can use, because according to some evidence that we have from different research done in different countries, most teachers still believe in a lot of neuromyths. They are false claims about how the brain works, how the mind learns. And because they believe in those neuromyths, they might actually be influenced by them when they're planning their lessons. So if they use the Engage, Build, and Consolidate framework as a source of reference that is validated by the science of learning, no matter how experienced they are, I'm pretty sure that they can achieve better results. So it works for everyone across different subject areas and levels of competency and, of course, time of experience. So it's highly recommended.